Joining us now from Ottawa for their reaction to the inquiry are Pam Palmater, she's the Ryerson Chair in Indigenous Governance; Chief Judy Wilson, she is Secretary-Treasurer of the Union of BC Indian Chiefs and Chief of the Neskonlith Indian Band, Kukpi7 Nation. She's also a survivor. Her sister was murdered nearly 24 years ago. And Cheryl Maloney is a founder of Eastern Door Indigenous Women's Association. Thank you all for your time on what I know has been a long and at times very emotional day. Chief Wilson, could I begin with you and your reaction to the report?
Yes, I was at the pipe ceremony this morning, and I think it was really important to set the tone that way through acknowledging the survivors and the families and our ancestors, especially our creator, in bringing in the report. And then with the ceremony itself, it was inclusive of all the different parties that were part of the national inquiry, but I also felt for the ones that weren't able to tell their story through the national inquiry process. There's still many, many stories out there that were not documented, that were not being able to be shared. The actual report itself, it is bringing the truth to Canadians. It's bringing truth to the Parliament buildings. It's bringing the truth, and it's going to be echoing through every hallway of justice. And that's what the report is calling for, the calls for justice. Because if our leader is not able, the country is not able to say squarely that this is colonial genocide, this is genocide straight out front, I think we have a problem. We have a problem with denial, and we have to move beyond denial to tell the truth, to be able to heal the past, to be able to move on with the actions that are needed. We need some implementation and we need some action, but there's a gap. There's no blueprint on the implementation. There's nothing binding on the provinces on how they're going to do this. How are they going to? The ministers showed up today. They got a copy of that report, but I see, they keep saying they're going to review it. Premier Horgan released an announcement today as well that, he did say, he recognized as genocide, that there is portions in there that towards the work towards self-determination. But we need more leaders coming out there and saying that, and calling it what it is, but moving beyond that, the word genocide, because we've lived each and every day of our life through the genocide, and we survived it. And we need to move on to the next chapter, which is implementing in that a plan, a national plan, and having actions for the call for justice to make some meaningful changes for our people, for all of society in general, so we can be working and walking down that road together in regards to making this country a better country for the women and the girls that continue to go missing, that are continuing to be murdered.
You make a couple of points, at least, that I want to pick up on some more as we continue our discussion. But first, Pam, to you now for your initial reaction to what you heard in the report.
Well, I was really pleased by, three core themes. The first one was, calling it genocide, not in an academic way, not in just a political way, but based on testimony, expert evidence, and their own independent legal analysis, that's a legal finding of fact. So it's really not up for debate. And it supports what the Truth and Reconciliation Commission report also found genocide. And that's important to remember. The other key aspect of this report is that they found, as a matter of fact, that this crisis of murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls was created by the state, which is, federal, provincial, territorial, municipal governments, failing to uphold the basic human rights of these women and girls and breaching their human rights. So in addition to our Aboriginal rights, it's very basic human rights that were not being met. And I think, the third thing that was really encouraging was the really strong call for a national, comprehensive, coordinated action plan that involves all governments, led first and foremost by Indigenous women as the path going forward. And so this isn't about Canada coming in and saying, okay, well, we're going to fix this, because they already made a real mess. This is really about Indigenous women and girls taking the lead and saying, here's how we'll go forward, and this coordinated national approach to make sure it happens.
And Cheryl, to you for your thoughts.
Well, one, I think my reaction started the day before when I was reading it and seeing the truths of the families that I've worked with. I've seen them in the document. I've seen our recommendations in the document, and I was pleased with that. So, and I was moved by that. Then we move into the existing recommendations. It's not a lot of new things we're asking. We're asking to uphold the existing laws that are part of this country, existing rights, international constitutional rights of Indigenous women. And the other thing that I was really pleased by is this was done by Canadians, or the call out to Canadians, but I never forget the fact that as Indigenous women, when we started this battle, we were alone. And it was actually Canadians that started taking to the streets and letting know the former Conservative government that Canadians don't approve of this. Canadians aren't happy with this, and they showed that by turning out in the polls. Mm-hmm. So whether this government, current government, says genocide or not, doesn't mean a lot to me. I'd like to hear from all the political parties. But I think we have one key challenge that's before us. And that is, how do Indigenous women lead? How do we ask the women that are being trafficked from Nova Scotia to New Brunswick lead the changes? And the way things have been done, and with the TRC, is we went to the existing colonial structures, which is in the Indian Act, or representative organizations, and there's always a battle of who represents who in this country. And none of those groups, organizations, or existing colonial structures represent that girl that's homeless on the street. Nobody is representing that young girl that's being trafficked from small Nova Scotia over to Moncton, New Brunswick. And our girls are taken from there to New Brunswick, and if they can get them past New Brunswick, then they're off, and we may never, ever, ever see them again. So the problem and the challenge, I think, is how do we get those Indigenous women to lead? We can't do the same thing that we've been doing over and over again. And the representative organizations are not representing the grandmothers that are on water walks or in ceremony or on the front lines. So I think that's a big challenge for not just the government of the day, but Indigenous governments, Indigenous communities, and women.
Well, and many people, as you know, are pointing to policing as part of the answer there. Michelle Odette, one of the inquiry's commissioners, says the RCMP needs major reforms and called on Ottawa to establish, quote, robust and well-funded Indigenous civilian police oversight bodies to prevent police negligence and misconduct in rape and sexual assault cases. Pam, I see you nodding off camera here, so why don't you pick it up there?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, and these were some of our very targeted submissions to the National Inquiry, that this isn't just about a situation of under-policing. So on the basis of racism and sexism, they don't file reports, they don't look for missing people, they don't believe Indigenous women when they've been raped or assaulted. That all happens, and that's very problematic, and it still continues with all the police forces. The RCMP is particularly problematic. But then there's the other side, the darker side, that was not really explored in this report, and it's something that really should come out of this report, that there should be an inquiry or some kind of investigation into police forces that have a problem with sexualized violence, specifically towards Indigenous women and girls, but also other racialized women, their involvement in human trafficking, their involvement in child porn, the high rates of sexual assault amongst their own members, but also amongst vulnerable populations, especially young girls. And that's something that, you know, we only see tidbits of it in the media, but it's a real problem. It's a public security, and even a national security and public safety issue that we've tried to get Minister Goodale to act on, but there hasn't been a real appetite. And we're hoping that maybe this National Inquiry report will shine enough of a light on some of the problems that we can push then for real fundamental change within all of these really dark problems in policing.
Chief Wilson, I want to ask you to pick up on the policing question, because a lot of this is not new. And that's some of the reaction we're hearing from many, especially in the Indigenous community today, is, well, we've been telling you this for decades, some of this. We've all heard about the tragic Highway of Tears, where women have gone missing for so many years now. So with this new call to action, Chief Wilson, what do you think has to happen tomorrow on the policing side? Is it more bodies? Is it more Indigenous-led policing? What is the answer?
Well, I guess I'll follow upon what Commissioner Buller said. They said, read the report. I think the commissioners need to take action and look at the report, but also in the national inquiry on the expert and the institutional hearings, they only provided 6 months of that, so there's only like a snapshot of the issues, and I think they were able to draw from other reports and other issues in regards to policing. There is a major policing reform needed, especially the criminalization of our women and the incarceration of our women. They're overrepresented in jails, and just the oversight is really needed. We have carding issues back in British Columbia, where our people are more targeted for carding, and also, you know, it's a telltale sign with the number of our people incarcerated in jails and in the justice system that fails them.
So is that money is the answer? When you talk about reform, why isn't it happening now?
I think it's the systemic biases and the stereotypes. I think it's got to start from leadership. I think it's in the RCMP. It's the relationship they have with our Indigenous people who they are supposed to be serving, but also, you know, the stereotypes that they card them, they criminalize them. I think all of those have to change. When we stand up to defend our land, for example, we're criminalized, and you know, we're targeted then. And many of our women are on those front lines, from the Trans Mountain pipeline to Unisoden with Wet'suwet'en, to Site C. All of those in the mines, you know, they're targeted and criminalized just because they're standing up for the land and the water. But in the regard to social issues as well, we see in our communities, you know, they're also targeted. So those have to change in the way the RCMP operate and their understanding of our people and relationship and reforms and their policies. So we do need to do a lot more work in that area for sure.
In his address, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau today said, quote, "You have my word that my government will turn the inquiry's calls for justice into real, meaningful, Indigenous-led action. We must continue to decolonize our existing structures." Cheryl, to you on that. What does that look like?
Well, I think the challenge with policing, child welfare, whether it's fishing rights, when we talk about self-government, we're calling for self-government. All these reports are recommending self-government, but we either have to negotiate it with the governments to see what they're going to allow us to do for self-government, and then they delegate authorities to us. That is not self-governance. And I think the problem we have with that is who are they negotiating with? And this is a challenge for Indigenous communities, Indigenous chiefs, council systems, Indigenous women, is how are we going to implement self-government if we keep negotiating within a very narrow Indian Act mandated government system? And so from the grassroots up, from the elected leaders, from the political organizations, the conversation isn't of whether free, prior, informed consent should apply or could apply. We're wasting a lot of time negotiating that. And so, you know, when the government says things are going to be different and we're going to give authorities to Indigenous peoples to lead that, are they doing the same thing and throwing dollars into representative organizations or representative groups? The real challenge, and I think the real focus for women should be over the next short term, is to look at how are women going to govern and how are we going to take that place, those places back within nations. And in order to do that, there's a lot of doors that our women that were leaders before my time had to kick down. They had to kick down those doors to get a seat at the table. Now we're at some of those tables, but we're not allowed to speak. We're the eyes, the ears, we're observers, and that has to stop. And I think one of the challenges and one of the recommendations was, you know, these rights are already existing. Domestic human rights, international human rights. But for Indigenous women getting into the international level and promoting their rights, it's impossible for us to get there. A lot of our women can't get to those international tables unless we're invited by a national organization or a provincial government or a federal government, and then we're on delegation, our hands are tied. So women are absent from all kinds of tables, and I don't know how that's going to change. That needs to change from within the Indigenous communities also.
Oh, I have only about a minute left. So Pam, I'll go to you for this final thought on where it goes from here. I wonder, how confident are you that the national action plan by the federal, provincial, territorial governments will be implemented? And bearing in mind, on the federal scene, we have about 3 weeks left before the House rises, and then we're into an election when they come back in the fall.
Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, I have every confidence that all of these governments have enough money, resources, capacity to do what needs to be done. I don't have the confidence that they have the political will, because, you know, basically, in agreement with what everyone has said, I mean, we still have the Indian Act, which discriminates against Indian women and their kids, keeps them out of their own communities, denies them a political voice or a legal voice. And so that's like the blatantly sexist law in Canada. It could be changed tomorrow, but Canada won't even take these small steps, which have huge impacts, to address what's been considered a root cause of murdered and missing Indigenous women. And Canada is going to have to be pushed by every Canadian in this country to do better.
Maybe a federal election is the time to do that. I know many voices today saying they hope that is where it goes from here, with Canadians raising their voices. I appreciate the insights from all three of you today. Thank you so much for your time. Chief Judy Wilson, Cheryl Maloney, and Pam Palmater. I appreciate this time.
Thank you.